Well, thanks for the opportunity of presenting here today. I'd like just to begin very briefly by answering what is coming back to one of the questions that was posed to Tim. And I think this is an important question because it's really about the changing landscape of the system information system. I'd like to characterise what's going on here is that in a national sense, what we're trying to do is encourage the internationalisation of statistics in some ways, try to make sure that we better capture these international dimensions. But on the international scene, it's really thinking things about the nationalisation of international organisations. Increasingly what we're being asked to do at the international level is think a little bit like national statistical offices in the terms of the way we construct statistics for the world, if you want, or for larger regions. So on the one hand, we've got this increasing push for internationalisation, getting more information on exporting and importing firms, but equally, international organisations need to think a little bit like national organisations in the compilation and production of new statistics. And the Trade and Value Added database initiative that we've launched with the WTO is perhaps a very good example of the way that this has to work in terms of the system information system going forward. Now, I'm going to be very brief in terms of some of the background for this work. I think we've had a long discussion already this morning about the motivation and the drivers for this information system. Tim's report captures a lot of these themes very well, but I just want to go back very quickly to perhaps some of the key drivers for the work. We saw in Professor Brennan's presentation this increasing fragmentation. The DVD example, I think, was very good at illustrating how these flows translate around the world. And we see this explosion in gross trade statistics. And Walter's chart that showed this explosion in gross trade statistics well illustrates this nature of the double counting of trade as we see this increasing flow in intermediate goods and indeed services. And so, of course, we live in a world now where we have gross trade statistics providing perhaps less relevant information than they once were able to because of this double counting. And they affect a number of policy areas, which I'll probably come back to later rather than run through them here. Now, Professor Brennan also showed perhaps a few micro studies that allow us to start thinking about trade in a value-added sense. So we illustrated the Boeing, the iPad, lots of different micro studies that reveal the importance of thinking a little bit differently about what trade means and where the value was created in the chain. The difficulty, of course, with looking at the micro examples is extending that to the macro picture. We want to know about what this all means at the whole economy level. And equally, there's another important point that we shouldn't overlook when we think about these micro studies, which are often referred to as screwdriver economics. They only go one level down. So in the presentation on the Boeing 787, I think it was, you said that 35% of the value originated in Japan. But a large part of that value would also originate somewhere else further down the chain. And one of the only ways you can really capture that, certainly at the macro level, is to use a global input-output table. That allows you to capture all of the interactions and allocate the value added right to the beginning of the chain and right to the end of the chain. So you can see a whole global value chain, and you can see where the origin industry was and the origin country was at the global macro picture. So what are we doing as part of this initiative? Well, the OECD for many years has harmonised national input-output tables and produced that information at the national level. So we're just illustrating national input-output tables that are comparable. But so to create the global input-output table, we have to link this information together, and we link that information together using bilateral trade statistics. And we're using a methodology that's been tried and trusted by many different institutions. Many of them are referred to here. And the database with the results was released for the first time on 16th of January this year. We were releasing a further release next month, but I'll come back to that. This is basically a very short listing of the many indicators that we have. I'll run through perhaps the key indicators. Perhaps the easiest one to get your head around is what we're referring to as domestic content of exports. And so this chart here shows for a selection of countries the domestic value added that's created as a percentage of each of those countries' exports. And what you see is that certainly over the last 2 decades, the domestic content has fallen, as we'd expected, because of the international fragmentation of production. And it's fallen in many, many countries, but not all. In the UK, for example, we've seen a general rise, and what we're seeing there, of course, is specialisation in services. So a smaller share of manufacturing, more services where there's a higher domestic value-added content. And we also have some interesting stories emerging for countries like Italy, where we see that this may be something that's a reflection of the relatively low productivity we've seen in Italy for about 10 or 15 years. But generally the picture is of this international fragmentation, lower domestic content and value added. And I think one of the key stories here, of course, is China. As it's basically opened up and it's acceded to the WTO, we've seen this massive integration into global value chains, and as a consequence we see a significant fall in its domestic value-added content as it becomes integrated. No say for Korea. The black line illustrates, if you want, the sensitivity global value chains have to supply shocks or slowdowns. Because what we see in 2009 is that domestic content increased, and that's not necessarily a good thing. What it's telling us is that the global value chains, the more fragmented the production process, the more it was hit by the synchronized slowdown in trade in 2009 than those production processes that were largely self-contained within an economy. What we also see, of course, is that in many sectors, particularly transport equipment and electronics, the import content, which is the light blue part, is significant. And I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. What we can also show, of course, for each of those countries is what the origin of the import content was. And the picture paints, if you want, a pervasive image in terms of the hubs, really. So what we see in Europe, of course, we see these manufacturing hubs around things like transportation, where we see large shares of any country's given exports originating in other countries in Europe. I've just illustrated here the situation for France and Germany. France is interesting because of its domestic value-added content, more than half of that domestic value-added content actually originates in the service sector in France and not actually the manufacturing sector. So there's something very interesting there. We also see this same level of international fragmentation of production in other regions, and I've illustrated here Mexico electronics and Korea electronics, where you see very low domestic value-added shares, but very high domestic value-added shares originating in neighbouring countries, NAFTA in Mexico and other parts of Asia and Korea. Equally, another important message, and this is really important in the context of protectionist policies, and indeed the drivers of competitiveness, we see that increasingly the overall share of intermediate imports that are being used to satisfy export markets are rising considerably. And we see that throughout Europe, and indeed throughout all the countries in the database. The little dot illustrates the share in 1995, and the column illustrates the share in 2009, and it's broken down by a number of sectors. In Hungary, for example, nearly 90% of all its intermediate imports of electronic products are actually used to satisfy the export market. And 2/3 of all of its imports, of intermediate imports, are used for exports. Italy, again, is another interesting point. What we've seen in Italy is that it's gone the other way. And again, like I said, this could tie in with this very low productivity we've seen in Italy in the last 10 or 15 years. It's gone now. Now, another important point, of course, is the role of services. We don't see an awful lot of trade in services, although it's increasing, and for some countries like Ireland, it is important. But at the global level, about 1/5 to 1/4 of total trade is in services. But if you think about the upstream producers of services into the production process, we see that actually when you measure trade in value-added terms, the contribution of the service sector's total exports is significant. In most OECD countries it's about half, and in Ireland you'll see that the ratio is about 70-odd%, which is perhaps not surprising to many of you, but what is interesting is the foreign content share of Ireland's exports of services, which are very high. And that can be categorised and shown at all levels, and it's not just the situation that we're exporting high services in and of themselves, it's the fact that the services are acting as inputs to the production of goods. And so you can see this is an average for all of the 40 countries we currently have in the database, and it's high throughout the board. About 1/3 to 40% of the total value of an exported good originates in the service sector. So that really tells us that an important driver of competitiveness is the service sector, and if you want to improve competitiveness, it's about liberalising the service sector. Opening yourself up to foreign competition is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you can improve the efficiency of the service sector. Finally, in terms of some of the messages that come from the database, well, of course, what we see when we look at the world in trade and value-added terms is a very different narrative emerging in terms of what trade balances mean, because we shift value from the originating country to the final consuming country. And I've given an example here for Japan, and what you see for Japan is that it uses Korea and China as manufacturing bases, And so it sees a fall in its trade surplus with those countries, but at the same time, it sees an increase in its trade positions with other countries like the United States. So you see the shift of value added, the shift within the chain going forward. Now, this is perhaps the most important part of this presentation in terms of the objectives of this particular session. It's about really trying to understand what the data is telling us. And we had this big splash in January to release the database. It got widespread coverage throughout the world, really. I mean, basically, a lot of countries picked up on it. But what was really reassuring is that the journalists fully understood the nature of the challenges that we had and fully understood exactly how important it was that we make progress going forward. And I just extracted one of the articles here. It's about paving the way for further developments in this area. And in that respect, I think it's important to emphasise that this is a work in progress. It's important that we illustrate and present the results now, because of course we need to better understand how global value chains need to be implemented in the policy debate. But at the same time, it's also important that we take the opportunity of releasing these estimates now to improve the statistical quality going forward. Without sometimes illustrating the importance of the results, you don't actually get an awful lot of the motivation at the national level or at the policy level to see changes being made in the core statistics. And so really, it's important that we try to improve the capacity building of national statistics to capture this international dimension. Now, we have a few assumptions through necessity that we use in creating global impact output tables. And so we have a number of challenges going forward, a number of areas that we'd like to see improvements. Perhaps the most obvious one is to resolve these inconsistencies we see within the international trade system in terms of mirror statistics. I think we can no longer leave that on the table, and at the OECD, and certainly I know that Eurostat have been doing work on this for many years, we will make a much more concerted effort to try to reconcile these inconsistencies in the trading goods system, because that will have an automatic beneficial spillover into our work and the quality of our results. But really, fundamentally for me, if I took, if you want, a blue sky vision in terms of where I want to see the work going forward, it's really about having a new approach to the development of supply-use tables more generally. Within the National Statistical Office, supply-use tables are traditionally an instrument if you want to create balanced estimates of GDP. But increasingly we need to think a little bit beyond that. We need to think that actually it's also an instrument that allows us to measure trade and value added. But the assumptions that we have at the moment in the trade and value added database mean that we treat all companies in a given sector in the same way. So we assume that they're homogeneous in a particular sector. But we know that those firms that are more integrated into global value chains typically use high content of imports and have a slightly different market. And domestic firms will generally have lower content of imports. And so we're averaging this out, and to some extent what we're doing is we're underestimating, or under-reflecting rather, the importance of foreign content and not really fully revealing the true nature of these global value chains. And so, for me, the important point is, let's think a little bit about how we produce supply-use tables. Typically, in a conventional sense, when people want more detail on supply-use tables, we revert to having more industrial breakdowns. So we say, let's have 3-digit or 4-digit rather than 2-digit. But I think that we need to start thinking about a different type of approach in terms of more detail. And what we're trying to push for in terms of development of some of the core underlying statistics is to focus an awful lot on some of the heterogeneous dimensions of the firms themselves. And so let's look at a 2-digit classification of industries, but break that classification down into foreign-owned firms, domestic-owned firms, factorless firms, and so on, or those firms that have high export intensities and high import intensities. That may be a better way of dealing with the issue at hand, global value chain, than just having a simplistic expansion of industrial classifications. I have 5 minutes, I'm nearly there. But that is really probably a longer term thing. Like I said, it's a blue sky idea. What can we do now? I think clearly there are some things that we can do at the bread and butter level. Certainly we can improve the quality of bilateral trade statistics. We can also encourage better import flow tables, which are embedded within supply-use tables. We can start thinking about better confidentiality rules within the gross trade statistics, because quite often we see suppressions of items at the 6-digit level, which are often they often lead to suppressions at two-digit levels. And what we'd like to see is a different way of thinking about how we create confidentiality. Let's try to make sure that no two-digit cells are suppressed. If we have to, choose another six-digit cell. That's the way things should be. We also need better information on re-exports, and many countries, the Netherlands being one of them recently, who's hit me over the head, have offered to give us very detailed re-export data, and a few other areas. But perhaps the most important, of course, is to have much better information on trade and services. And at the moment there, we have this statistical lacuna, really, not a great deal of information, so we have to target a lot of firepower improving the quality of that information. Now, what else can be done? And this ties in very, very neatly with some of the recommendations in Tim's report. It's about really trying to get more information that captures heterogeneity. If we can't have supply use tables that are built from the bottom up with capturing heterogeneity in mind, let's think about slightly more simplistic ways of doing this. Let's try to create indicators that reveal heterogeneity as indicators in and of themselves that we at the OECD can bring into national supply use tables to create and capture that heterogeneity from the outset. Now, we organised a workshop together with Eurostat. In fact, it was called Going Beyond Tech, or Tech Plus, I can't remember the exact definition that we used, to explore the feasibility of capturing some of this heterogeneity and to see what type of stylised survey we could use going forward. And the objective really was to think about how much information we could get while still preserving confidentiality, because it's all very well asking for breakdowns by export intensity and breakdowns by import intensity and breakdowns by ownership and breakdowns by size and breakdowns by industry, but eventually you hit a brick wall, which is called confidentiality, and you start having to thinking about aggregations back again. So it's really to explore what could be done. Now, perhaps the important point here is, and we touched on this in a few questions, is what we refer to as trade and income. And this ties in with this notion of we have to have information on ownership within the system. And I guess that this is perhaps the best country to start thinking about things like trade and income, because I know that Ireland is certainly more effective than most in terms of these differences we see between GDP and GNI, and the need to try to get better handle on what really the economic impact of ownership and foreign flows and income are. I'll come back to that just towards the end. Finally, of course, we need to have better classification systems. The industrial classification systems at the moment are to some extent archaic. They tell us about a different world. And we need to encourage the classification systems to think a little bit about the nature of the firms with which we're confronted with today. And that's something that's being pursued on this task force on global production that was referred to in an earlier presentation. Now, going forward within the OECD, what we want to do is measure jobs and skills, and we've had lots of arguments as to why this is important, and we will be releasing some provisional estimates on jobs at our May release. But there are challenges there as well. I mean, we want to have better, more coherent data between the underlying value-added statistics that we see and the employment statistics that we see. This is a challenge in and of itself, because we know that we have often flawed productivity estimates for some countries because they don't have that internal coherence. This is another important dimension if we want to understand employment and globalisation. Finally, in terms of the important extension, this is perhaps one of the most important. Going forward, we need to start thinking about trade and income. I mean, there are two reasons. One, of course, is because if you have value added being generated by a foreign affiliate in a particular country, that value added may very well be recorded in the national accounts of that country, fine. But it may also be only recorded in that country for tax reasons. And what we actually see is an economic transaction that flows back to the parent company. So one could argue that actually that payment is a payment for an intellectual property or an underlying service that isn't recorded in the trade and services system. And we should try to impute that flow back. Now, I'm not saying that we should necessarily do that, but I am saying that it does illustrate that it's important to think about the trade and income flows. And who is the ultimate beneficiary? Now that, of course, implies that we need better data throughout the board. And I think that exactly the same types of data requirements that follow from these needs are articulated very well in Tim's report. I mean, fundamentally, we need better facts data that's integrated with the underlying business statistics. So just a very quick summary in terms of what's needed. We need perhaps a new approach to the way we produce supply use tables, better gross trade data, both in services as well as goods where we have issues. The linking to microdata is essential in terms of capturing that firm heterogeneity that will improve the quality of our results considerably. And of course, this notion of trade and income ownership and facts is essential. We will be releasing new data at our ministerial meeting in May this year, along with a comprehensive report on the policy implications from global value chains. And we're going to extend the data set to not only cover jobs, but also extend the coverage of countries to 57 countries and go back in time. Thus far, we've only had data from 2005 to 2009. I've illustrated some of the provisional results that are emerging from our database from 1995 to 2000. And finally, perhaps the most important thing here is that we want to have a statistical conference that we've organised in the middle of September at the OECD to discuss the statistical challenges involved in creating estimates of trade and value added. And many of you will be invited to attend that particular conference. So that's what I wanted to say. One final point. In terms of some of the motivation for this work, we've both been working very closely with some countries and we work very closely with China. And within China, what we were able to do is get them to start thinking a little bit about this new world of supply use tables. And they produced, especially for the projects, and I think they're going to continue to do it going forward, a breakdown of their input-output table to reflect, if you want, 3 different dimensions. One dimension of industry, which was producing goods and services for domestic markets, one dimension of industry, which was the processors, and one dimension of industry, which was the exporting firms who weren't processors. And so we got a much better handle on the value-added to output ratios for each of those different types of firms, as well as the import content, because of course processing firms will have a very high import content. So I think I'm done, I'm out of time, so thank you.
Thank you very